2 weeks ago, when the Tories were demanding schools stay open in spite of a new COVID strain, they said it was because they care so much about Britain's kids, they just couldn't possibly deny them their education. You might ask then, if they care so much about this country's kids, why, almost a year from the start of this pandemic, they still haven't sorted out laptops and the internet for students? You might also ask why, before pressure from one of Britain's best footballers, they were expecting kids to live off £5 worth of food for a whole week. Yes, time and time again throughout this pandemic, kids have borne the brunt of this government's cold-hearted incompetence, which is our main theme for the day. I'm joined by Bastani, who, as someone who lifts, would, I'm sure, not be happy to be told to live off a small plastic bag of tuna and a block of cheese for a week. Is that correct?
I don't lift anymore, but well, I mean, maybe when I was your age, Michael, yeah, I would have been upset. Certainly, if somebody had given me a takeaway milkshake cup of tuna to live on for, let's remind ourselves, this wasn't even for a week. This was for 2 school weeks, 10 days. These photos you're seeing, crazy.
Mm-hmm. That's disputed. Well, we'll get into these in detail as to exactly the details of the paltry portions people have been sent. Later in the show, we'll discuss why it's non-essential businesses being open, not members of the public taking walks, that is undermining this lockdown, and explain how one of Keir Starmer's questions at PMQs today totally backfired. First, though, we can't really start this show without mentioning that today a new grim record was broken. In the past 24 hours, 1,564 coronavirus deaths were reported in Britain. That's 1,564 parents, grandparents, friends and partners who will be sorely missed. That figure also means that for the first time, Britain's pandemic death toll has surpassed 100,000 people. We can look at the day's statistics there. You can see that. I mean, the one silver lining potentially is that infections are finally starting to fall. Now, that 100,000 figure is reached by adding the past few days of government announced deaths to the most recently available statistics from the Office for National Statistics. The ONS and government count differs because the ONS include people if coronavirus was on their death certificate, whereas the government only include people if they've had a positive test. There's a Guardian graphic here which shows you how those two different figures are reached. So when the government stands up and says there's a total of 84,000 people who've died from COVID-19, that's not necessarily the most accurate portrayal of the death toll, of the cost of this disease and the government's handling of it. Aaron, I want to briefly go to you for comment on this. And I mean, the thing for me that really sticks in my claw, the thing that I still find difficult to believe is when we were having these conversations in the first wave of the pandemic, when there were, over 1,000 people for around a week, I think, dying a day then. We didn't know that at the time. It was sort of when they updated the statistics afterwards, that's what we knew. And that was the worst part of that first wave. There were actually quite a lot of complicated explanations for what had gone wrong. It was clearly that Boris Johnson was incapable of taking decisive action. Also that they had sort of made this self-defeating attempt to protect the economy over health. It completely backfired. We had more people die than most other places and a worse economic shock than most other places. But they also had scientific advice that didn't seem perfect, right? There were lots of very smart people who had made a mistake when COVID first arrived. They treated it like a flu instead of treating it like SARS. There were different explanations for why that monumental error was allowed to happen. This time around, none of that exists whatsoever. We knew what virus we were dealing with. The scientific advice from SAGE was incredibly clear. We need a circuit breaker back in September. We need a lockdown in mid-December. They've been very clear that we need urgent action to stop this number of people dying in January. Boris Johnson didn't listen, and here we are. Aaron, I want to go to you on this monumental failure from this government. There's no other way to describe it.
Yeah, I think the sort of descriptions become quite hackneyed and you become accustomed to them, but it is by far, and today has just really compounded this, by far, the biggest political screw up in this country since the Second World War. But I think you have to say in its democratic history, I think since at least we've had universal suffrage, right? So you're talking you could say the 1920s effectively as a decade, right? Which is a really remarkable idea that, you have to go back at least 100 years. Arguably, you'd have to go back further. And to sort of illustrate the scale of what just happened in the last 24 hours, Vietnam's had 35 people die of COVID altogether. 35 people. So we're looking at about what, 48 times, 49 times, almost 50 times the number of deaths in Vietnam since this thing began, since they had their first cases in January, February last year. And in one day, we've times that by 50 almost. And it really is abject. You know, it's a humiliation for the country. It's a tragedy for the people involved. And I think you're right. You know, when you compare it to March, April last year, they saw it coming. We've obviously taken so many more precautions. We're all wearing masks and so on. We have tier 4 lockdowns and whatnot, which really, you know, underscores just how potent this mutation is of COVID. And I feel like the government really didn't think that was going to be an issue as long as the number of deaths stayed below that psychologically important 1,000 number. As morbid as that sounds, I'm sure in their sort of strategic communications discussions, you know, they were sort of modeling, okay, well, from a sort of political fallout point of view, what's the worst that can happen? And I don't think they were looking at, you know, significantly more than 1,000 deaths a day. And you can only infer from what's happened over the last 2 weeks that we're going to go to more than 1,500 deaths a day. You're right. The cases are coming down, but we're still dealing with the fallout of opening up for Christmas and so on and so forth. So who knows? I mean, nurseries are still open. There's still a great deal of society which remains open. Public transport's in far greater use than it was in the April lockdown. You know, schools are being far more frequented than they were before in April last year. So we don't know. Again, we're kind of flying blind, and that's what the mutation did. You know, you could say that public policy was difficult April last year, March last year, because nobody really knew what was going on with this virus. And of course, that argument could be extended to this mutation. But I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's accurate because we've known about this since September. And the frank and grim reality is that both parties are complicit here. That's not to say Labour couldn't have done some things differently, wouldn't have done some things differently. I think they obviously would. But it does feel like neither major party took this mutation as seriously as it should have been taken from September. And in that respect, it does feel like it's a carbon copy of what we saw with COVID-19 first time around last spring.
You're touching on lots of issues we're going to talk about throughout the show today. An exchange between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson, which really brought out both of their failures over the past weeks and months. Of course, as Aaron said there, just because we've seen cases for the first time in a long time start to fall, that doesn't mean we're going to see deaths or hospitalizations fall anytime soon. If it's only now that cases have started to fall and they're still at a very high level, we wouldn't expect to see deaths increase for another 3 weeks. So we can expect to be starting many more shows, sadly, with new record-breaking death tolls. It didn't have to be like this. We're going to move straight on to our main story for the evening, which is sort of the treatment of kids by this government. First of all, you know the score. Please do share the show link. We want to get more people watching this live. Tweet your comments on the hashtag Tysky Sour, and we'll be reading your super chats throughout the show. Now, since schools closed due to COVID-19, it's been the government's responsibility to make sure those entitled to free school meals don't go hungry at home. Now, it's fair to say they haven't risen to the challenge. So Twitter user Roadside Mum posted this image of a food parcel she had been delivered for her child, which she was told was meant to survive her 2 weeks. It's rightly gone completely viral. She tweeted alongside this, she said, hashtag free school meals bag for 10 days, 2 days jacket potato with beans, 8 single cheese sandwiches, 2 days carrots, 3 days apples, 2 days serene, 3 days frubes, spare pasta and tomato, will need mayo for pasta salad. And she said this was issued instead of £30 vouchers and that she could do more with £30, to be honest. I think most people could do more with £30 than that. In the following tweet, she priced it all up as costing £5.22 if you were to do that shop at Asda. Now, the reference there to £30 vouchers is because that's what most parents were given during the first lockdown to cover 2 weeks of lunches for kids on free school meals. This time, however, the Department for Education had urged schools to issue parcels instead of vouchers. Now, it was presumably because they, like Tory backbencher Ben Bradley, believe that if you give vouchers to poor people, they'll just trade them for drugs and prostitutes. He actually implied that on Twitter late last year. But as that photo shows, the parcels being delivered to feed kids will not suffice. You know, they are not nearly as useful to you as a £15 voucher or a £30 voucher. And most importantly, they are not enough to nourish anyone, right? This has got people questioning where all the extra money is going. Now, so the company responsible for the parcel you just saw there is Chartwells. They're a subsidiary of Compass Group. They're the world's largest catering provider, with recorded profits of £1.8 billion in late 2019. It gets worse or more dodgy, more suspicious. Until December last year, the chair of the Compass Group was Paul Walsh, a Tory donor who signed the Captains of Industry letter at the 2015 election encouraging people to vote Tories. So this is all sounding quite familiar. Money which was meant to be going to support people directly or to support our pandemic response directly is instead going to Tory chums who waste it. They pocket quite a lot of it and they provide a terrible service. There has been some pushback from Chartwells, which, you know, in that very brief exchange of Aaron in at the start of this, I implied, they've said that this was, in fact, this parcel that you've just seen was not actually for 2 weeks. It was actually for a week. The school did tell the mum that it was for 2 weeks, but maybe there was a mix-up of communications there. They've also said that they were only paid £10.50 for that parcel, not the whole 15 if it were for a week, and that they'll be including the extra £3.50 from the following week. But 1 week or two, £10.50, £14, £15, whatever, the public is still being shortchanged. And importantly, it appears Chartwells aren't the only company delivering substandard food parcels to Britain's school kids. So after that first tweet went viral and was boosted by Marcus Rashford, parents flooded to Twitter on Tuesday with images of what they'd received. So we can take a look at some of those now. So this image you'll see now is the Twitter user said this was for two 12-year-olds for a week. You can see they're not nearly enough calories. They're supposed to, I assume, have cheese sandwiches every day for a week, or cheese on potato. You've only got one protein source there. This is the worst one that I saw shared, which we can get up now, I think. And every aspect of this is appalling. Not only is that not enough food, but they've been given a quarter of an onion, half a tomato wrapped in cling film. Now, once you cut a tomato in half, it goes off pretty quickly. And the bit that's most disgusting here is you've got a little dollop of tuna in a money bag, a bag where you sort of take coins to the bank. So this is just an insult, basically, to whoever is receiving that. Now, since these photos went viral, this is one of those moments where having Twitter and footballers who give a shit about social issues is quite effective. Since that all happened over the past 24 hours, our political leaders have come out to say this was a disgrace. This is Boris Johnson speaking at PMQs today.
I don't think anybody in this House is happy with the disgraceful images that we've seen of the food parcels that have been offered. They are appalling. They're an insult to the families that have received them. And I'm grateful, by the way, to Marcus Rashford, who highlighted the issue and is doing quite an effective job by comparison with the right honourable gentleman in holding the government to account for these issues. And the company in question has rightly apologised and agreed to reimburse. But it is because we want to see our kids properly fed throughout this very difficult pandemic that we've massively increased the value of what we're providing. Another £170 million in the COVID winter grant scheme, £220 million more for the holiday activities and food programme, and we're now rolling out the national free school meal voucher scheme, as we did in March, to give parents the choice to give kids the food that they need. Under this government, we will do everything we can to ensure that no child goes hungry as a result of the privations caused by this pandemic.
Now we can focus on that final sentence there from Boris Johnson. This government will ensure that no child goes hungry because of the privations caused by this pandemic. Well, you might ask Boris Johnson why he expended so much political capital in October refusing to grant school meal vouchers for kids over that half term. We wouldn't have had vouchers over the summer if it wasn't for Marcus Rashford. And then again, they tried to deny it again, and they managed this time in October. We also might want to point to data from the Food Foundation, who, after surveying 4,000 families, found that food insecurity in households with children had nearly doubled since the start of the pandemic. Now, food insecurity, that can seem like a bit of an abstract construct. abstract concept. Sorry, what it means is that you're worried that you're not going to be able to eat enough food because you don't have enough money, right? So it means that you are worried that you can't give yourself or your family the sufficient nutrition that they need. Aaron, since these images emerged, Johnson, Williamson, and the rest of the cabinet have all lined up to say these parcels are a disgrace. It is a shame that it took a top footballer to notice this, but I want to get you to, I suppose, summarize, because you made a great video about this yesterday where you were arguing that it wasn't just a mistake that these pitiful food rations went out to Britain's kids. This is actually the system working as it is meant to work. This is the Tory government functioning, not dysfunctioning. Can you explain that argument?
That's absolutely right, Michael. So Britain, for the best part of 25 years, Britain has been the world's second largest outsourcing market after the United States, which is pretty remarkable when you think it's got a population of 65 million people. After 2010 to 2015, the Tories created a record number of jobs in the private sector. And David Cameron and George Osborne said, this is our jobs miracle. What we know is actually most of those jobs were effectively jobs in the public sector, put into the private sector through outsourcing and whatnot. And it meant low pay, greater precarity, people lost sick pay, holiday, pensions, things like this. And so that model of outsourcing was at the heart of a low productivity, low wages, precarious economy. And for the Tories, that represented success. So outsourcing is bad from the point of view of workers. We knew that already. But what we're seeing here, and this is only just the latest episode of it with Chartwells and so on, is that outsourcing fundamentally leads to terrible, terrible outcomes with public services. So you can think of Carillion, which lost hundreds of millions of pounds worth of taxpayer money because it collapsed. A building contractor which didn't really own any fixed capital, didn't actually have any employees. It was effectively an intermediary between the state and other building companies. Strange, but there we are. You can think of our rail operators in this country, privately owned, yet they receive extraordinarily high subsidies to carry on. Of course, they were bailed out last year by the government. The government temporarily is running our railways, which again, from a sort of capitalist enterprise point of view, is you can't socialize all the risk, socialize all the downside, and don't just privatize any profit. Literally subsidize these private operators. Hugely interesting as well is that there was actually one line, the East Coast Main Line, which the government had to take into public ownership, not once but twice. And one of the times they took it into public ownership, it actually ended up being the best performing line in Britain. It was winning awards, and it actually required, as the state-owned line, the lowest subsidy of any line in the country. And guess what? It was put back into private ownership. So we can look at Carillion. We can look at Serco with Test and Trace. We can look at G4S and the Olympics. We can look at now Charterhouse and a bunch of Chartwells rather, and a bunch of other companies with regards to these free school meals. Outsourcing isn't working. And it's not working for a bunch of reasons, but fundamentally one of them is compliance. What's the downside? What's the punishment if you don't actually come good on the promises you make? Well, we know nothing happens. There is only upside for investors and for shareholders. And the fundamental problem, and of course the government will try and explain this away through, there's some mistakes, a one-off, it's a bad person, it's a supply chain problem. The fundamental problem is, Michael, we are paying private businesses to feed children who come from poor backgrounds in a pandemic. We shouldn't be doing that. Now, why would a private business want to do that? They would want to do that in order to make money. And if you want to make money, often you have to cut corners. And so we're seeing that, time and time again. I do think, though, in this instance, you can talk about Carillion or rail operators. I think in this instance, I think the idea that private companies would be involved in this transaction between the state and children who are going to really struggle and are hungry, the idea you insert a private company there and their fundamental primary ambition is maximizing shareholder value, I think that's evil. I genuinely think that's evil. And I think very few people think that private businesses should be doing that. I think they think the state should be doing that, and it isn't. And that's a major, major problem. So this is not an aberration. It's not a mistake. It's not an error. This is the norm of outsourcing, albeit, of course, this is one of the sort of more catastrophically obvious, conspicuous examples of its failure. But we have so many examples of it failing that we have to, we have to make the conclusion that this is business as usual for outsourcing, and it can't carry on. And we can have all the celebrities and all the leftist influencers and Labour politicians on Twitter, and it can go viral, and there'll be another public outrage over this, just like there was with Carillion, just like there was with the East Coast Main Line when it was put into public ownership and then privatized again. We can keep on having those kind of emergent, realizations that this doesn't work, but it's going to happen time after time after time. We need to understand as a society, this is a status quo system, outsourcing, privatization. We need to get rid of it. There's no center ground here. It's broken. You either fix it or you don't fix it.
Mm. And there is an alternative. I mean, as you say, I think that point you raised, that it's, you speak to a neoliberal, they'll say, yes, there are problems with outsourcing, but it'd be even worse if it was in-house. We've seen time and time and again, you mentioned the example with East Coast Rail Line. That's not actually true. When you bring it in-house, it functions better. And on school meals, we also have an example. So yesterday, Jonathan Pryor, who is a Labour member on Leeds City Council and Cabinet Member for Learning, Skills, Employment and Equality, tweeted this image comparing what private companies are sending kids across the country and what Leeds' in-house catering service are sending out. So you can see there on the top, that's that image we just showed you of the tuna stuffed into a money bag. Then on the bottom, you've got a hamper, which looks, that looks like a pretty balanced diet to me. Alongside the image, Jonathan tweeted a comparison between one example of a private provider for free school meals and Leeds City Council's in-house Catering Leeds box for next week. For this box, we get £11.70 for 5 days to replace school lunches. Privatising doesn't work. And if you look at that image, that's a good argument as to why privatisation doesn't work. And I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan today. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Good evening. How are you doing?
Very well. And yeah, congratulations to Leeds City Council on putting together a better food box than any of the multi-billion-pound outsourced companies manage. My first question to you is about this distinction between vouchers and hampers, because I think anyone in our audience will look at that box and say that is a good quality box compared to what we've been seeing elsewhere on Twitter. But there'll also be people saying, why not just give people the money? Even a high quality box, maybe people would prefer the choice of going to the supermarket. What's your answer to that?
So at the start of the lockdown 3, the government have said that schools needed to go with whoever their provider was, be that kind of a private provider that was providing some of these substandard ones, or indeed kind of in-house ones like ones in Leeds. They have U-turned on that. I mean, kind of most government policies are followed by, and then they U-turned on that. But so now kind of we're going through our list of schools to give them the choice to say, look, do you want to carry on with the boxes or do you want to move to vouchers? And a lot of schools are saying they want to stick with the boxes. We've had proper nutritionists go through them to make sure they're getting everything they need. They get a menu card with it, so we know they're getting enough meals. So it gives the schools the guarantee that their kids are getting fed properly. And if they're getting fed properly, they're going to be learning better as well at home.
And in your tweet, you said, this is an example of why privatization work. And I thought, could you go into a bit more detail? What do you think it is about companies like Chartwell's which mean they can't do it as well as your in-house service? Is it that they're wasting money on shareholders? Is it just that they don't really care about the job? Why do you think Leeds' in-house catering service is able to do this so much better?
Well, I think there's a long answer and a short answer, and the short answer is there's no one skimming off the top. You said at the start of it, like the profits that some of these companies were making, and those profits from companies who are there to feed hungry children, it's money that should be spent on feeding hungry children. And I don't think that should be a particularly controversial thing to say. And it means we can just put all of the money we get into providing the service. In Leeds, we've got, I believe it's the largest in-house workforce of any council in the UK. And having that, it just means we've got such a great team as well who are just ready to help at every stage. It means that over the holidays, not just Christmas, but kind of the October holidays and the February one coming up, we were able to move workers into putting together packages for free school meal kits over the holidays as well. If you're locked into a contract, they're not going to do anything unless you pay them extra. So actually, the benefits of kind of having that in-house workforce, it benefits the workers we employ, it benefits the city we serve. I don't see a downside. The only reason to be against it is ideological.
Now, Also, actually, I mean, how many councils are doing this as well as you? Are you quite rare in that you've got this in-house service, or are there a bunch of councils across the country doing this as well?
I'm not sure. I've come across a few others that have got a decent in-house service. I've also been contacted by quite a few people across the country in the past day alone saying, how do we replicate this in our area, in our council? So there's definitely an appetite to increase that. I mean, Leeds is really established in, you know, having workers in-house and having a good in-house workforce. It means we can do things like pay the Living Wage Foundation living wage to them. Carillion was mentioned before. When Carillion went under, we insourced all the Carillion, well, some of the Carillion apprentices into the council. And it just means that the council can be there when there are these great failures of capitalism. We can kind of pick up the pieces and do a better job.
And while we've got you, your education lead in Leeds, there's a couple of sort of more general questions about the pandemic I want to ask you, which is, I mean, firstly, there's been a lot of controversy about who is and who isn't getting laptops. Are the government providing enough? What are you seeing as the challenges of kids working at home, and what could government policy, you know, is government policy basically doing enough to make it possible? And the second question is about, you know, are there too many kids in school? Because basically people are saying one difference between this lockdown compared to the first lockdown is that then there were barely any kids turning up to schools. Now we've got quite a lot of kids turning up to schools, and that means that we're going to get on top of cases much slower than we did back then. So what's your experience been of kids learning at home, and of whether or not you agree that too many kids are turning up to school at the moment? Yeah,
I mean, the two issues are linked. The government was under unbelievable pressure from the unions to close the schools. And they did, but then they basically opened them by the back door by kind of expanding the definition of kind of key workers and expanding the definition of vulnerable children to mean that a huge amount of kids are coming into school, which means to a lot of extent the schools aren't kind of closed in the same way they were. I mean, the schools never closed in the first lockdown. They were always open to key children, but there are so many more now. And one example of vulnerable children, the government have now said that if you don't have a laptop at home, if you don't have digital access, you're vulnerable. And it's fantastic that the government have finally realised that, and that how important that digital inclusion is. But it sticks in the throat a bit when they actually slashed the laptop provision to kids only a few months earlier. You know, kids in deprived areas, they just don't have that access. We're trying to do bits as a council to try and get more laptops out there. We're running schemes to get people to donate second-hand ones, to refurb and send them back out there. But it's pushing water uphill. You know, we can do a bit, but we can't do everything, you know. And because at the same time, this is when the government are just not funding councils at all. Over the past 10 years, we've had £2 billion taken from Leeds. They've not paid us for the things we've spent on during COVID. So when we want to come in and do stuff, we just lack that kind of flexibility, that financial flexibility. On the kind of the key workers that are coming in, we've been work with some big employers in the city to try and say, yeah, the government kind of says you're a key worker, but if your employees can keep your kids at home, please do. You know, but this is the issue as well, because the government hasn't really done furlough properly this time. In March, it was stay at home. It was very simple. This time it's, well, stay at home if you can. If you have to go into work, go into work. You know, it's a half-hearted job that kind of has knock-on impacts at every level.
Absolutely. And I mean, these are all completely linked. The reason why there are too many kids in school at the moment is because the government hasn't paid people enough to stay at home. We're going to have to leave it there. Jonathan Pryor, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening.
Thank
you. We are going to go on to a very much related story in a moment, which is, why does it take a footballer to force these kind of changes? You can bet that whilst we had, you know, all of these government ministers standing up and saying, oh yes, it's a disgrace now we've seen these boxes, if they'd have seen them without social media, without a footballer taking this on, you can bet they would have said, well, that seems fine to me, even though they wouldn't have fed it to their own kids, of course. And we have 2,000 people watching. Do subscribe if you're new. Put your super chats in. We will be reading those throughout the show. And we do have one. Loz Hennessy with £15 was in school today on rota, saw kids picking up food parcels, 2 flimsy carrier bags. I saw a kid's plastic bag break on the way home, but there was so little food it could all fit in the other one. Oh, God, that's a really tragic comment. Thank you for telling us that, Loz Hennessy, even though, I mean, I'm sure that will infuriate most of our audience. Let's go on to our next story. So it took tweets from parents and then, crucially, their boosting by Marcus Rashford to make this government act on the meagre parcels being sent out to Britain's school children. And if there was any doubt Marcus Rashford is the nation's real opposition leader, he tweeted the following today. Just had a good conversation with the Prime Minister. He has assured me that he is committed to correcting the issue with the food hampers and that a full review of the supply chain is taking place. He agrees that images of hampers being shared on Twitter are unacceptable. Boris Johnson got in on the act. He quote tweeted Rashford and said, I totally agree with you, Marcus Rashford. These food parcels do not meet the standards we set out, and we have made it clear to the company involved that this is disgraceful. The company concerned has rightly apologised and agreed to reimburse those affected. Now, this is all very well. I'm glad that Boris Johnson has come to his senses, and there will be some pressure on these companies to either put more food in the baskets, or schools will be told, you know, if you want, you can get the vouchers, if that's what the parents want. But this U-turn, as with all of them, it's not a one-off event. This is not the first time that action from Rashford was needed to intervene and to make sure that our government paid sufficient due to the welfare of Britain's kids. Of course, back in June, the government had planned to end free school meals for students over the summer holidays. It was only after Rashford's intervention they were forced into a U-turn. Now, as is often the case during this pandemic, Piers Morgan did a brilliant job this morning skewering Matt Hancock on why he had opposed basic measures to ensure kids don't go hungry, or why he'd opposed basic measures to ensure kids won't go hungry until Marcus Rashford got very publicly involved.
Really glad that we're able to send out food for those who receive free school meals when schools are in, and I'm really glad that we're able to do that when schools are out.
If you're that glad, can I just ask you a difficult question? Why did you vote against it?
Well, I'm really glad we were able to put it into place.
Yeah, but if you're that glad about being able to put it into place, again, why did you, as Health Secretary, vote against this?
Well, because the reason that I'm glad now is because we've been able to sort that out and put it in place.
Well, the reason you're glad now is that you got shamed.
No, thanks to you.
Let's be honest, you got shamed into it by a football player, a young football player with a conscience, who managed to prick the conscience of you and the government. Do you regret now, given how glad you are that it's now happening, do you regret voting against it?
Well, of course, I'm pleased that we're making sure that.
That wasn't the question. I just asked if you regretted. But hang on, it's a very important question because you wouldn't have done it without Marcus Rashford campaigning. My question for you is, given how glad you now are that it's happening, do you regret voting against it? It's a yes or no.
Well, as I say, I'm really glad that it's happening now.
But do you regret it? Do you regret voting against it?
Well, I'll put it this way. In the first lockdown, we took this action. And now, as you say, we're in
Health Secretary, you only have to say yes or no, whether you regret it. You either regret it or you don't.
Well, I'm really glad that the situation's been resolved.
So you regret voting against it?
I'm really glad it's been resolved and we've sorted it out. And I'm going to use my own words to describe my own feelings on this one.
So you won't answer the question?
Well, it's that I'm answering the question, and I'm really glad that we've sorted.
Well, let's just hope going forward we don't rely. Let's just hope we don't have to rely, as we have to again this week, on Marcus Rashford to once again expose the iniquity of this system, because these kids are in lockdown, they're suffering, they're hungry, and they need support, and they need proper support from you as Health Secretary and the government.
What a coward. He's the Health Secretary. He's one of the most important politicians in this country. He had the power to make sure that kids didn't go hungry over the summer, and he could have put forward himself that there would be vouchers given to kids over the holidays during the pandemic. But instead, what did he do? He opposed it. In Parliament, the Tories were whipped to oppose Labour's suggestion that we give vouchers to kids over the summer holidays. So he is basically saying, I'm glad that I didn't get what I wanted. I'm glad that someone defeated me. I'm glad I lost because I'm so evil that if I'd won, some really bad things would have happened. Yet he can't say he regrets it. It's just, I don't regret what I wanted. I'm just glad that I didn't get what I wanted. It's bizarre. It's cowardly. Aaron, I want to bring you in on that excruciatingly awkward interview.
Like you say, the guy's the health secretary, Michael. You know, he's not a junior minister. He's probably one of the sort of, alongside Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, I'd say he's probably the most identifiable politician for the general public right now. And he just comes across just appallingly. And like you say, firstly, it's incoherent what he's saying, doesn't make any sense. But secondly, the Tories love to talk to working people. Take some responsibility. Take some responsibility. Take some ownership over your decisions and how you voted. You could just say, yeah, I don't think that was the right call. You're a politician. You can say things in ways which, perhaps are a little bit more palatable to the powers that be, to the chief whip, to Boris Johnson, right? To his various advisors, to Rishi Sunak. But he just comes across just like a little snake. And it applies to so many politicians. But I think Matt Hancock in that particular moment was supremely snake-like. I mean, it's just embarrassing. I don't think Labour are doing a great job as opposition, but you look at the Tories polling 40%, high 30s, do you think, who the hell are these people? To look at Matt Hancock in that moment and go, yep, that guy's doing a great job. Yeah, really, really professional, responsible guy. It's shambolic. It is utterly shambolic. How can the health secretary say that? He's the person who's in charge of this country's health. By the way, he's obviously doing an appalling job because we've literally just passed the death toll of 100,000 people, But my God, how many car crash moments do you need with one guy before his political career is over? 10 years ago, one thing like that was it. Matt Hancock, gone from sort of public life. It's going to take years to recover from that. These are happening every day. We can't keep up. There are so many. That's the first time I've even seen that, heard about it, I hadn't seen it. And yet there doesn't seem to be any sort of major political overhead. A lot of that is because people have goodwill to the government because, of course, it's a national crisis and COVID was happening. This isn't entirely because of them. But I think also that's giving them a bit too much latitude. You can't have politicians not even owning the decisions they make like a month, 2 months ago. Unbelievable.
We're going to go in one moment to a cabinet minister who wasn't just evasive, but was outright dishonest. That's in one moment. First of all, Ishtak with a $4.99 super chat says, come on, guys, smash that fudging like button. Do what Ishtak says. Smash that like button. It helps us in the algorithm. It means more people will come and watch this show. Now, it's not just on the question of school lunches that the Tories have been screwing over kids. And when it comes to schools, the charge sheet against this government can seem endless. Failing to provide laptops 10 months into the pandemic, screwing up exam results, and failing to equip schools with the tools they needed to open safely are all unforgivable. But perhaps the most damaging failure of government is the constant last-minute decisions made on school openings. Most dramatically, this saw the government close all schools 5 hours after Johnson insisted to the nation that wouldn't happen and that they were safe. And that announcement to close all schools came 3 weeks after Gavin Williamson threatened to sue Greenwich Council if they took lessons online for the final few days of last term. It was an eminently sensible decision by Greenwich Council, and it was an outrage the Department of Education stepped in with legal threats to stop them doing this. It probably would have prevented deaths if they had been able to do that. Now, at the Education Select Committee today, Gavin Williamson was asked to explain his decision to threaten Greenwich with legal action. In his answer, he pointed out rates in Greenwich were lower than in other authorities with open schools. He also had this to say about the new, more transmissible COVID strain.
The knowledge of a new variant was certainly not something that we had any understanding and knowledge of. And you'd seen authorities and schools right across the north of England, right across the Midlands, being in a position where we'd had this amazing partnership working, where we'd worked together, dealing with some really tricky issues and case rates much higher than we're seeing in Greenwich, and being in a position where children were able to continue to get in education. So it would have been remiss of us, and it would have been wrong of us not to take action where there was a local authority where case rates were just so much lower than all those other local authorities right across the north, right across the Midlands, where we'd had that partnership working together to keep schools open, but taking action where was necessary to help them and support them in the containment of the virus. As I say, at that stage, none of us were aware of the new variant, and we were not aware of the impact that that would ultimately have in terms of case rates and the impact more widely right across the country and including in London.
Now, some people will watch that and say, this is just a complete red herring. The new variant didn't have anything to do anyway with whether or not schools should be closed. Now, I would push back a little bit on that, because there was a lockdown in November. Schools stayed open and cases did decline in most of the country. The new variant mattered because in Kent, where it was already super prevalent, and in London by this point, that wasn't enough. With the new variant, schools were such a hotbed of transmission. They're a hotbed of transmission everywhere, but to such an extent that there was no way of getting R down whilst keeping schools open. So if he was right that they had no knowledge of that new strain, I still don't think that would have justified giving legal threats to Greenwich, who just wanted to close a few days before Christmas to stop children giving COVID to their grandparents. But it would, it would stand up. It would at least give some weight, some excuse to what he had done. The problem, the dates don't add up. So let's look at the timeline of the events with respect to these threats that were given to schools in Greenwich to Greenwich Council. So it was on the 14th of December that Department for Education sent a letter to Greenwich councils threatening them with legal action if schools were closed. I think we can get a headline up now with the date there. You can see that's the 14th of December. The following day, on the 15th, the council backed down and agreed to stay open. Now, they didn't want to do this. In a statement, the Labour councillor said he did not agree it was right to keep open the school, but he had no choice but to ask our schools to keep their doors open to all students rather than just continuing with online learning. They had no choice. They were forced into it, basically. So was Gavin Williamson right? Did we have no understanding of the new strain when they sent that letter on the 14th, and when the government, the local councils and head teachers, against their will, made a decision to move away from online learning? Well, this is Williamson's cabinet colleague Matt Hancock speaking in the House of Commons on Monday, December the 14th.
Over the last few days, thanks to our world-class genomic capability in the UK, we have identified a new variant of coronavirus, which may be associated with the fastest spread in the southeast of England. Initial analysis suggests that this variant is growing faster than the existing variants. We've currently identified over 1,000 cases with this variant, predominantly in the south of England, although cases have been identified in nearly 60 different local authority areas, and numbers are increasing rapidly.
So that's not ambiguous. He's saying there is a new strain, and this new strain, we think it's more transmissible, and it's going out of control in the southeast, right? So this idea that Gavin, we had no idea about the new strain back there. Well, the whole country had an idea about the new strain there, because Matt Hancock, your cabinet colleague, had announced it in Parliament. That was the main headline in all of the newspapers that day. And it was the following day where you celebrated because Greenwich Council, against their wishes, opened schools right up to the run-up to Christmas, with the new strain running wild. So he has essentially, it's not just like Matt Hancock being evasive to Piers Morgan. Gavin Williamson has lied to Parliament. He's lied to a select committee. And I mean, to me, there are so many sackable offences with this guy, but it is getting to a point where, as you say, Aaron, it is extraordinary that we have a government that's polling, somewhere around 40%, when you've got cabinet members openly lying about such a crucial issue, which will have cost lives.
Yeah, I think I'll be quick. We've been here before, actually, as a country, in terms of this kind of crisis. This is a huge, I think this is the biggest crisis in Britain's democratic history, not once, but twice. And I include, for instance, 1940, the First World War, or the Suez Crisis, which is insignificant compared to this. But obviously, I think the Second World War, 1940, is an interesting sort of parallel. You have a Tory prime minister who's not particularly well liked. We're at war with Germany, the phony war. You have a campaign in Norway, which doesn't really work out very well. The Wehrmacht is sweeping through Europe, and it becomes pretty clear that Neville Chamberlain isn't the man to lead the country. And Labour do a deal with various Conservative MPs, and they ensure that he goes, and then they'll have a government of national unity. And you look at that, or you look at, for instance, the removal of Anthony Eden after the Suez crisis, and you just think, what's it going to take for Boris Johnson to have to go? Because in those two instances, it wasn't, by the way, that it wasn't the opposition playing politics. It was the party of government. It was the Prime Minister's colleagues who were not playing politics. They were doing politics, because the first job of politicians is to ensure the safety of the people that they're governing. And that clearly is not happening in the context of COVID over the last year. And so it really is unprecedented. We have not been here before. If you look at Suez, if you look at the Second World War, 1940, this kind of maladministration, this kind of idiocy at the head of government, this level of venality and stupidity and just incapacity for solving problems meant people were removed quite quickly, far more quickly than what we're seeing with Johnson. And I don't know. I genuinely think we could go to 2,000 plus deaths a day, and I don't think anybody would be saying that the Prime Minister needs to go. I mean, it is genuinely remarkable. And I think it's going to be something we're going to look back on, not when this is over, probably after April, because I think hopefully we'll be out of the worst of it by then. And I think people reflect on this and go, wow, 150,000 people died. And, you know, we lost almost 50 times the number of people Vietnam lost over the entirety of this crisis in one day, repeatedly. And yet there weren't really that many calls to Prime Minister to go, even. Right? The only people saying Boris Johnson should go are like left-wingers on Twitter. I mean, it's crazy. It has never, ever, ever unfolded like this in Britain's democratic history. You live in a democracy, you have an independent media, you obviously have opposition parties, you have a vibrant civil society. But none of those kind of democratic stabilizers have kicked in. You know, Amartya Sen has a thesis, which he basically says, as an economist, Nobel Prize winning economist, that you don't have famines in democratic societies because, of course, governments seek re-election. They can't behave in the same way that Britain behaved in Bengal or Ireland and so on and so forth. And we're seeing that kind of hypothesis tested to breaking point. This is not how governments are meant to behave in democratic societies.
I'm going to go to a couple of comments. Willie94 on Twitch chat says, so we also stream on Twitch. Most of the cabinet are there because they were close to either Cameron, Osborne, Johnson or Gove acolytes. A very small number of Tory MPs with their own gangs controlling the party, complete dearth of talent. And if they ever lose an election, they could be screwed. I think that final point's actually, who's going to employ Gavin Williamson after this? You know, he's got one of the most powerful jobs in the country. And yet, if he were to lose it, I mean, you wouldn't employ him to work in any. What business would he be a suitable person to work in? And he's got one of the most powerful jobs in the land. Lucy with 4.99 on the YouTube super chat says, my brother is still being told to go into work Monday to Friday to valet the cars of Harrogate's upper echelons despite lockdown. Not good. I'm really glad you've put that comment there now, because it relates directly to our next story. As the COVID death toll rises in Britain and the pressure on hospitals mounts, government sources have been furiously briefing the press that the real problem is Britons just won't follow the lockdown rules. To hammer the point home, Home Secretary Priti Patel delivered yesterday's Downing Street press briefing, delivering this warning to any potential miscreants.
So my message today to anyone refusing to do the right thing is simple. If you do not play your part, our selfless police officers who are out there risking their own lives every day to keep us safe, they will enforce the regulations. And I will back them to do so, to protect our NHS and to save lives.
And so, I mean, it's significant that Priti Patel went out and and said that. I think actually more impactful is the fact that you've got all of these Downing Street people briefing the press, which means that you've got the media who are saying, we need tougher measures. Why aren't measures tougher? It's all completely missing the point. That's because the main difference between this lockdown and the one last March isn't that now more people are going for walks and maybe drinking coffee with a friend, because, you know, after all, it's quite difficult to catch COVID-19 if you're outside. It's that many, many more workplaces are open this time around. That means that people are taking risks within workplaces. And importantly, actually, it means people are taking public transport to those workplaces. It's much more dangerous sitting on a train than it is sitting in a park. But it's very much in the government's interests to have the public distracted about that simple fact. So to discuss the extent to which this lockdown represents business as usual for most workers, I'm delighted to be joined by Janet Nash from the Hazards Campaign. Hazards is a network of health and safety campaigning groups, activists and union safety reps who give advice to workers on how they can keep safe and get their bosses to stick to health and safety regulations. Thanks so much for joining us, Janet. First of all, I wanted to ask you, in terms of people being asked to attend workplaces, can you describe to our audience how the lockdown we're currently in, from your perspective, differs from the one back in March?
I think back in March, employers responded to the fear of COVID coming. That they saw that the transmission rates were going high, and employers responded as much as anything. In fact, lots of them locked down before the government said to lock down. People stopped at home. This time, is that it's nearly normal. There's most of the workplaces are back, and I know in some of the trade unions they're saying that nearly all their members are back in work, and that's across whole different industries and sectors. And and the ones that are at home, have been at home working, are being asked to go back to work. People that were shielding have been asked to go back into workplace, and none of that's safe. So it's a totally different atmosphere in workplaces really now.
And I mean, what's your analysis of why it is that more people are going back? Because I mean, it could be, there's two hypotheses. So one is that, people actually are less scared of the virus now, and they also want to get out of the house. So people aren't necessarily that resistant to going back into work as they were back in March. And the other is that businesses are basically pressuring people, even forcing people to go back into the workplace. I mean, from your experience, from the people you're advising, which one of those do you think is more an accurate portrayal of what's going on this time around?
I think definitely it's about them being pressured to go back into work. We've got people ringing us up who are absolutely fearful about going back into the communities, going back into the workplaces. They know that their employers are not controlling the risks. They've not reviewed the risk assessments to make sure that they're looking at the transmission of this higher transmissible variant. So they've not reviewed them. They've not introduced, things like proper ventilation in there to combat the aerosols that are transmitting the virus. So so people are absolutely terrified.
And finally, if any of our viewers are being, encouraged or pressured, or however you want to put it, by their bosses to go back into their workplaces, what advice would you give them? What rights do they have to say, no, I want to continue working from home, or no, I want you to furlough me? What are the rights and opportunities for workers to push back against this?
If you're in a trade union, see your trade union, talk to your trade union representatives. People are safer, twice as safe before the pandemic if you're in a trade union organised workplace. But you need to be asking your employer what the risk assessment is. So what's changed that's making you go back to work? Because the government is saying that anybody that can stay at home should stay at home. Actually, when you're looking at risk assessments in terms of addressing the risks associated with the infection, first of all, employers should look at can the job stop? Does it need to take place at all, that job? Can we furlough people and just stop it altogether? Then there's control hierarchical approach to controlling risks. So secondly, can that job be done in a different way? So if people were teaching before, can they teach online rather than face to face? So that would get rid of the risk of infection. And then they should look at things like, is the employer looking at engineering controls? Have they improved ventilation? Have they put in place additional cleaning, all those sorts of things that are associated with controlling virus? And lastly, is there still a residual risk? So have they introduced proper PPE, proper face masks at standards, the industry standards? And if they've not done that, then they should contact the HSE, the local authorities. They should say, my employer is forcing me back to work and they're not controlling the risks. And they should be raising the concerns with the authorities. Now, I mean, whether they'll get much support from the authorities is another matter, because they're under-resourced and on-demand. But that's what should happen. And then, if that's not happening, then they should be contacting local authorities, MPs, anyone, to raise the issue, and certainly joining a trade union, because if they're not in a trade union, then you're at most risk, in workplaces now.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I think that last point of joining a trade union, to me, makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons, but also because, I mean, dealing with all of this, on an individual level just seems very, very overwhelming. Not many people know, I mean, myself included, the details of health and safety regulation. So yeah, I think be part of a bigger collective, which means that you can, push back confidently against these things. Janet Nash, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Yeah, keep empowering workers to make sure that this lockdown doesn't go on for as long as I think the government would have it go on for with their
Can I just say,
platform. Yeah, of course.
Sorry, can I just say that the last resort in workplaces, if you're not safe, then you've got Section 44, Section 100 of the Employment Rights Act. You might have heard about it, but that says that you can take yourself out of an unsafe situation, something dangerous and imminent danger, being in imminent danger, remove yourself from that situation and not suffer any detriment. And that's our last step in protecting ourselves, really. So thank you very much.
We have an example of that working, don't we, with the National Education Union? That's actually what forced the U-turn. So
absolutely. And what was really important about that was it was a collective action of individuals that took that decision. So it's an individual action, but of a collective, done in a collective way. And that was really important.
Absolutely. Janet Nash, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
I want to throw back to Aaron immediately, because for me, I want to focus on the media coverage of this, because it's something which seems to me so obviously significant in terms of why this lockdown isn't working as well as in March. But the media aren't asking any difficult questions about it. I don't know if you watched the press conference yesterday with Priti Patel, but other than Sam Coates from Sky, who, credit to him, asked a decent question along these lines, you had BBC, ITV, even The Guardian lining up to say to the government, when are you going to make the restrictions more strict? We've got people walking around parks and that wasn't happening last time. Right. Keir Starmer actually took a similar line today at PMQs. And even though they phrase these as tough questions, they're exactly the question the Conservatives want to be asked. Because if you are, especially if you're a Conservative politician, if you're being challenged to say, why aren't you making people's lives even more miserable than you are? And you get to respond, well, we actually think that mental health matters. It does. I don't think we need tougher restrictions when it comes to people being in parks. Then all of this briefing from Downing Street sources is basically to encourage the media to ask questions that are kind of irrelevant. And the media are just taking the bait. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the big explanation for this is bandwagoning bias. And it's something you see time after time after time with the British media, and for a bunch of structural reasons. It's basically people that all know one another. They're all in London. They all go to the same schools and universities. And it's actually quite an insulated profession. And that's not specific to Britain. You could talk about, the Washington, DC press pack and so on. I think it's worse in London because, London is just the center of not just political life in this country, but economic and cultural life too, in a way that, the United States doesn't have. And what you find, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Corbyn, a panoply of issues, they basically all kind of take each other's lead. And if one person says something and another person says, well, that must be the line, that must be the question. And it can work in a number of ways. If there's a bad guy that a couple of them have latched onto, then they tend to sort of move towards it as a pack. But again, here, I think it's to the detriment actually of public debate and informed conversation, in so much as you're right, there's a talking point, which is obviously this is not TIV4 is not working. We need to, in some ways, enhance the lockdown. What would that look like? What does it mean? What would be effective? And rather than, I think, you're very good at this, Michael, questioning one's own assumptions, questioning what the person next to you is saying is the right thing to do, saying, well, okay, let's try and open this up a bit, prize it a bit, and let's ask the difficult question for the government. They're not doing that, and we're not, you and I aren't epidemiologists, but I think you're right to say there's very little evidence to suggest that it's people getting takeaway coffees, which are the issue here. And what's happening is, this is, like you say, government communication strategy. We saw that yesterday with Priti Patel, but it's being extended by the media, and it's very effective, by the way. You can go onto any one of local Facebook groups. You can see it on Twitter. You can see it below the article in terms of comments on various news pages. People think we have a problem because people are meeting up for walks. That they think that's why the government can't control the virus, and that's a failure of the media. That is a failure of the media. The media is there to inform the public and to enhance the quality of public debate, and they're not doing that. Again, they're acting as an extension of the Tory party's communication strategy, and I don't think that's deliberate necessarily. I mean, for some people it might be, but I don't think that's generally deliberate. I just think, again, it's about this bandwagoning bias they have, which is an outgrowth of the London Press Pack. Big problem, really, really big problem.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no point, and this is what frustrates, there's no point in asking a question which sounds tough when actually it's the pre-approved question that the government wanted you to ask. Very kind comment from It's Amy on Twitch chat says, Michael needs a question at one of the COVID broadcasts on BBC. He's been an amazing individual to follow on Twitter to be informed of the pertinent questions in this hellscape. That's very kind of you, It's Amy. I would love a question at one of those press conferences. I doubt they'd be keen to have a Novara Media reporter asking them a question at one of those conferences, but maybe, well, I don't want to say in the next pandemic. I'm hoping there won't be another pandemic. I would love to grill Boris Johnson. It actually really frustrates me that the only person who gets to grill Boris Johnson at the moment are Laura Kuenssberg and Andrew Marr, who are, I have to say, two of the worst political interviewers around, because they do exactly as you're saying, Aaron. They do all this bandwagoning where they fall into the types of questions that actually the government wants to ask them, and then Boris Johnson can bluster out of everything because they don't actually know that much about coronavirus. They haven't really done the research. All they comment on is what this person said, or what that person said, or what this person said, which means that they can come back to Boris Johnson saying, but this person said this, and Boris Johnson said, well, I said this. The audience is none the wiser of who's correct. Let's go to our final story. Before we do that, as will be apparent to you now, we stream on YouTube and on Twitch. So if you are, wherever you prefer watching these shows, you've now got the choice, and do comment on both of them and on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Now, Keir Starmer's script on the COVID pandemic has been clear for a while. Boris Johnson has been slow to act and is incompetent, and that failure from the government has cost lives. It was a charge Starmer repeated today at Prime Minister's questions. It's a true charge. We agree with it. But today in PMQs, it backfired.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says that effectively 2 days after that PMQs, the advice changed. The truth is the indicators were all in the wrong direction back at the last PMQs. But be that as is may, the Prime Minister says he got that advice on the 18th of December, 2 days after PMQs, and we've all seen the Sage minutes of the 22nd of December confirming the advice that was given to the government. The government's advisers warned the Prime Minister that the new variant was spreading fast and it was highly unlikely that November-style lockdowns would be sufficient to control it. Pretty clear advice on the 18th of December to the Prime Minister from Sage. Tougher lockdown than November is going to be needed. I've got the minutes here, everybody's seen them. Yet instead of acting on the 18th of December, the Prime Minister sat on his hands for over 2 weeks. We're now seeing in the daily figures the tragic consequences of that delay. So how does the Prime Minister justify delaying for 17 days after he got that advice on the 18th of December?
Now, that is a very good question. As we've said over and over again on this show, Boris Johnson's slow response to coronavirus has cost tens of thousands of lives. It will continue to do so. If you watched our show on the 21st of December about the new strain, you'll know we were saying it was madness that the government were not announcing an immediate nationwide lockdown with all schools closed. So that should have been a tough question for the Prime Minister. There were some real failings there highlighted by Keir Starmer about the job Boris Johnson was doing. However, the Prime Minister had a trick up his sleeve.
I must disagree very profoundly with what the right honourable gentleman just said, because he knows very well that within 24 hours of getting the advice on the 18th about the spread of the new variant, we acted to put the vast part of the country into much, much tougher measures. And indeed, they have, what we are now seeing, and it's very, very important to stress that these are early days, we are now seeing the beginnings of some signs that is starting to have an effect in many parts of the country, but by no means everywhere. And it is early days, Mr. Speaker, and people must keep their discipline, keep enforcing the rules, and work together, as I've said, to roll out that vaccine programme. But, Mr. Speaker, I do recall that on the day that we went into a national lockdown, and sadly we were obliged to shut the schools. Even on that day, the Labour Party was advocating keeping schools open for understandable reasons, Mr. Speaker, because we all want to keep schools open, but I think it a bit much to be attacked for taking tougher measures to put this country into the protective measures it needed when the Labour Party were themselves calling then to keep schools open.
It's one of those sad situations where the worst guy you know makes a great point. I wouldn't quite say it's a great point, but it's definitely a valid point to say, how can you tell me I've been too slow to respond to the evidence if you didn't say I should do what I did any sooner than I did, right? So on the 4th of January, on Monday the 4th, which was the day where Boris Johnson mounted that massive U-turn, where in the morning he was saying schools are safe and they'll stay open. And then by the evening, he was saying all schools will be closed because the scientists had to make, actually, it turns out the chief medical officers of all the nations of the UK had to make a pretty dramatic intervention to say, look, you're walking straight into a catastrophe for this country. He really had to be pushed. He really wanted to keep them open, and that would have meant even more deaths than what we're seeing now. But Keir Starmer's in no position to make that argument, because when did Keir Starmer change his mind? On the morning of the 4th of January, Kate Green went out onto the nation's TV networks to say schools should stay open. It was about, I think, 2 p.m. Where Keir Starmer actually recorded a pool clip with TV cameras saying, oh no, actually schools should close. So Boris Johnson is right. Keir Starmer can't really argue that Boris Johnson acted too late. I mean, other people can, because he did act too late, but Keir Starmer's not in a position to make that argument because he took exactly as long as the Prime Minister. Aaron, I want to bring you in on this. I mean, we were saying it at the time, there's no political explanation for why he's not saying that schools should be closed. There's no epidemiological explanation. There's no public health explanation. So it was just an own goal, and a dangerous one at that.
Crazy. It's one of those strange unforced errors, isn't it? And there was this, it was, again, talk about, bandwagoning bias. You had, the Labour front bench, you had, people who were oversee, West Streeting, Shadow Secretary of State for Schools, and you had Kate Green and Keir Starmer, and everybody saying, one day of school is missed is one day too many. And you're thinking, look, we're going to see thousands of people die every day unless we close down the schools. We knew that. Really, we knew that from the beginning of December. That was available data. That became increasingly obvious. But I think you have to be, let's be generous, by the middle of December. And I think after that really was inexcusable. And you had Labour on December the 20th, 21st saying, no, the schools have to open. You had Lisa Nandy on television. My jaw was dropping, Michael, because, you and I do these shows. We look at the data. And clearly with that new mutation, it was just a very strange decision to make. And as you've said on Twitter before, Michael, it's one of those moments where you can say, actually, with a bit of sincerity, the science had changed. You could say, well, with the old mutation, we could keep schools open to some extent. With this one, we absolutely can't. We absolutely can't. I'm sorry if kids are going to miss 3 or 4 months of school, but the alternative, as we're now finding out, is we're going to see a couple of 100,000 people die. I mean, that's what would have happened that's what will happen if we open schools and everybody goes there. We're seeing 1,500 people dying now a day, and that's with schools significantly closed, tier 4 lockdowns, and so on and so forth. So it was just crazy. It was just, I think, emblematic of Keir Starmer and the people around him. A bit similar to Ed Miliband. On austerity. Even Tory voters were not really that comfortable on a bunch of decisions being made. Austerity towards 2015 was actually not particularly popular. Yeah, David Cameron gets an enhanced majority because you had the leader of the opposition just really detached from any sort of meaningful conversations with the country at large. I think, he's in recent days, Starmer sort of being so kind to the GMB, to various trade unions, to Unite, I think it's because he really screwed up with the NEU. Now, the NEU is not an affiliated union to the Labour Party, but its members are Labour supporters, Labour members. They were really, really let down by this man. And it wasn't just, oh, Labour should back any particular interest within the Labour movement. You can argue it can, you can argue it shouldn't. But, this was just a clear threat to public health and safety. And it was coming, at a time where he should be trying to defend unions anyway. The labour market's a horror show right now. And he chose not to. It was just such a strange thing to get wrong. And it's been going on for a long time. We think about, open up schools in September, no ifs, no buts, universities and so on. And it's just, where is this coming from? Is he so frightened of actually having to make a political argument which even slightly dissents from what their focus groups are telling them? Because believe me, it goes back to the point I made earlier on about in 1940, the Tories basically got rid of somebody who was a terrible prime minister, or, they did something similar with Eden after the Suez crisis. Can you imagine Clement Attlee in 1940? Well, we want to get rid of Neville Chamberlain, but actually the focus groups are saying, that these swing voters that we need to get off the Tories to win the next general election, they're saying, this Churchill guy, not very popular, let's just stick with Neville Chamberlain. No, because you were at war, right? And okay, that metaphor might feel quite hackneyed. We're always talking about the Second World War in this country, but 100,000 people have died. I mean, so I think it's very, very legitimate to use a war analogy. Do we have to have another 50,000 people die, another 100,000 people die? And I just feel like, again, it was another instance of Keir Starmer. Sometimes you get a football commentator, like Gary Neville last night, Man United Burnley. Gary Neville said Luke Shaw should be sent off. He's overcompensating because he's a Man United fan. It's almost like Keir Starmer is actively undermining the interests of working people and public safety to impress Tories. And you think, what the hell are you doing? This is crazy. This is the last thing you should be doing. This is nuts. It makes no sense. There's no electoral gain to be made not even in the long term. In 2 weeks, you're going to look really stupid. And he's made his own bed there. And what I'm finding in the last couple of days is lots of people who I don't follow on Twitter or Facebook, what you'd call normal people, not political, nothing political in their bio, joking about Keir Starmer, not even attacking him or lambasting him or criticizing him, joking. Because the guy, he looks absurd, he looks ridiculous. And I think at the end of all this, there's going to be a real profound anti-political energy, I think after April, after May. And the sad thing is I think that will include Labour, because I think Keir Starmer to most people right now looks like all the other politicians, which is crazy when you think all the other politicians include Gavin Williamson, Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson. We're talking about complete idiots, morons. It should be pretty easy to differentiate yourself from them.
Yeah. I mean, what's so surprising, because sometimes I think it is a bit unrealistic when, people on Twitter say, look, they're the Labour Party, so they should back everything that the trade unions want. I mean, that's never been the role of the Labour Party. I don't think it's ever been demanded by the trade unions that be the role for the Labour Party. There's always been this idea that they have sort of relative independence from each other to some extent. But this was a situation where, I think they should err on the side of it, but this was a situation where you had SAGE, the teachers' unions, parents, everyone was saying you need to close the schools. And as you say, Keir Starmer seemed to be holding out for, I don't know, 2 people in a focus group you said 2 people in a focus group in the Red Wall, but there's no evidence people in the Red Wall wanted to keep schools open after it was completely apparent there was no way you could possibly get this pandemic under control if they were. So it just seems like almost like an act of self-harm to say, no, I am going to, it's a bit, actually, what it reminds me of is the Lib Dems with tuition fees, where they were, the public thought, you shouldn't back tuition fees because you promised that you wouldn't, back rising them, because you promised you wouldn't. Even George Osborne apparently was saying, look, you don't have to do this if you want. You can abstain on this one because it was in your manifesto that you wouldn't do this. And Nick Clegg's like, nope, to show I'm a serious politician, I'm going to go against the interests of students, the interests of my voters, the interests of my party, all to prove that I'm willing to do something stupid. I don't know. It's so bizarre.
But you also see it with Blair in Iraq. I mean, maybe it precedes that. I don't know. But there's this weird meme in British politics where real leadership is being unpopular. Yeah, maybe. You don't want to go anywhere the wind blows, right? I agree. But the idea that, there's a kind of reverse psychology going on here. It's like, yes, that can be true, but it's not. It's like a logical fallacy to think, well, anything I do which is unpopular, ergo must be sort of politically, expedient and clever. No, it's wildly unpopular because A, it's the wrong thing to do. B, the people whose votes you're trying to win don't like it, and C, the base which is literally underpinning the Labour vote right now, at 32% in the last election. Christ, young people, teachers, what are you doing? What are you thinking? Well, if I'm unpopular with the people that matter most, that must be the most intelligent thing to do politically. No, it's the worst thing to do politically. It's not that complicated, right? It's not that complicated. But then again, I don't want to overestimate Keir Starmer, the man with his Brexit tests.
Smart politicians do popular things. Anyway, we'll end it there. Stephen Gaskarth with $4.99. Never forget these politicians are only in their roles to create policy to benefit companies they will work for when they leave. That's it. I said no. Who would employ Gavin Williamson? The only people who would employ Gavin Williamson are people who sort of owe him one, because he, various policies that he announced benefited their kind of vulture-like corporations. Vaughan Folks Arnold, with a $5 says, I do an office-based role. They refuse to let us work from home. Spoken to the local authority enforcement and refused to attend. Lucky enough to do so. Oh, so that's a success story of someone pushing back. Good for you. I hope anyone watching this, takes spirit from that. Aaron, thanks so much for joining me tonight. And thank you to everyone for watching tonight and for your super chats, for your comments, for your tweets on YouTube and on Twitch. If you want to support us directly, then do go to novaramedia.com/support. We'll be back on Friday at 7 p.m. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.